The Banana King was one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. When a country's government didn't give him what he wanted, he simply overthrew the government. He declared literal war on his competitors, and he built a gigantic business empire from nothing. You see, before he became the Banana King, this man was simply known as Sam, an immigrant with no money, no connections, and no real hope. Sam's journey to building such a successful company is an astonishing underdog story, and throughout his life, Sam became entangled with countless famous figures, from US presidents to business magnates like JP Morgan. And yet, it all begins with ripe bananas. However, I must warn you, what starts out as an inspirational success story will later take a much darker, disturbing turn, as Sam became involved with an extremely controversial company called United Fruit, otherwise known as the Octopus, because of how they wrap their tentacles around everyone and cause devastating consequences. Honestly, I've covered a lot of fascinating business stories, but this is one of the craziest. You may never have heard the name Sam Zamurray before, but by the end of this video, you'll be glad you did. This is the insane true story of the Banana King. Sam Zamurray was born in 1877 and grew up on a wheat farm in western Russia. However, Sam's father died early in his life, and this put the family in a very difficult financial situation. Times were tough, and Sam knew he wanted more from life. And he also knew that his uncle lived in America, where he ran a modest grocery store. So, at the age of 14, Sam decided to go and join his uncle and try and build a new life for himself. Sam took every last penny he had and embarked on a one-way trip to the United States. Despite arriving with literally no money, Sam's plan was simple: start from the bottom and work his way up. And thus, initially, Sam worked for his uncle doing odd jobs in his store, like stacking the shelves. But Sam always tried to learn as much about the business as he could. He tried to talk to suppliers and customers and figure out what they wanted. Sam also took on a series of other odd jobs: tin merchant, house cleaner, delivery boy, all whilst trying to save as much of his small paychecks as he could. That way, when the right opportunity came along, he'd be ready. And that opportunity presented itself in 1893, when Sam's life changed forever. Because in 1893, just a couple of years after arriving in America, Sam saw his first ever banana. Now, here's the thing. In the late 1800s, the banana trade in America was still new, and very few Americans had ever seen a banana before, let alone eaten one. It was considered kind of a strange exotic luxury. So needless to say, when Sam saw that first banana on sale, he was intrigued. He likely bombarded the salesman with questions about what it was and how much it cost. By this point in his life, Sam had realized that to make serious money, his best option was finding a product to sell, instead of just working for other people. And for some reason, Sam was drawn to the idea of selling bananas. After seeing that first banana, Sam made his plan. He would head to the nearby port called Mobile, which is where the fruit boats arrived from Central America. Sam was then going to purchase some bananas of his own and sell them in the local area. It was a simple enough business idea, and nobody could have possibly predicted the incredible series of events this decision would cause. Sam traveled to the bustling port of Mobile in Alabama, where all kinds of goods arrived by boat from all across the world. Deals were then struck with salesmen and peddlers looking to buy these goods. When Sam arrived at the port, his initial plan was simply to watch and learn. On his first day, he watched excitedly as a boat sailed into the harbor operated by United Fruit. This company was the dominant player in the banana business, and they imported vast quantities of bananas from Jamaica. Sam observed the process. A boat would dock in the harbor, then a team of men would rush on board in unison to unload all the bananas by hand. There was no mechanical equipment involved back then, and countless thousands of banana bunches on board, so it was back-breaking work in the hot sun. The job was made extra brutal by the fact that scorpions often nestled within the banana plants and would randomly spring out and sting the workers. But as Sam watched on, he noticed something curious. After the bananas were taken off the ship, agents from the company sorted them into 3 piles. One pile was the greens in perfect condition. These were the bananas that would last the longest and thus could be sold for the highest price. They got loaded onto trains and shipped off around the country. Then, the next pile was the yellow bananas that were starting to turn. These wouldn't last quite so long, so were sold to local store owners and peddlers at a discounted price. And then the final pile was the ripes, bananas with black freckles on. Even though these were still perfectly good to eat, they wouldn't make it to market in time to be sold, because in less than a week, they'd go soft and start to smell. Thus, as far as the company was concerned, these ripe bananas were basically worthless. Now, back before refrigeration was perfected on ships, up to about 15% of all bananas in a shipment could end up in the ripe pile, as once one banana starts to go ripe, it causes other bananas nearby to ripen too, and thus these ripes were the enemy of those in the banana business. And yet, Sam became fixated on this big pile of ripe bananas which nobody was buying. Whereas all the traders seemed to view them as trash, he saw them as an opportunity. Maybe it was because of his upbringing where food had always been in short supply, but Sam knew a ripe banana could feed someone just as well as any other banana. The only reason most traders never bought them was because you only had about 3 to 5 days before they were unsellable. You had to sell them all fast, or you'd end up with a pile of worthless black goopy bananas nobody wanted. And most businesses figured they wouldn't be able to sell them all in time, so it wasn't worth the risk or hassle. But Sam was willing to bet on himself. In total, he had $150, literally his entire life savings from all the jobs he'd been doing in recent years. And so, once most of the green and yellow bananas had gone, Sam walked down to the pier to negotiate a deal. For the company agents selling the bananas, this must have been a bizarre encounter. A guy less than 18 years old with a thick Russian accent asking to buy a few thousand of the leftover ripe bananas at a heavily discounted price. However, since the company often couldn't sell these ripe bananas, they were more than happy to agree to the discount Sam asked for. And thus, the deal was done, and Sam was in business. He didn't quite spend the full $150 on bananas though, as he used some of the remaining money to buy a boxcar on the Illinois Central Railroad. This allowed him to transport his bananas to various different cities and sell them directly from the boxcar of the train. In theory, Sam's plan made sense. As long as he could sell all the bananas very quickly, he'd make a tidy profit, since he'd got them at a discount. But it's important to be clear just how high the stakes were. Sam was betting his life savings on ripe bananas. He was now entering into a race against time, as he would have just a few days to sell them all before they went bad. And thus, Sam bought a train boxcar for his bananas, and the train set off the following morning. Unfortunately, Sam had now spent all his money, so whereas most people would pay a few extra dollars to get one of the beds on the train, Sam had no choice but to sleep in the boxcar with all his bananas. But Sam didn't mind. He was excited. He'd done the calculations and was confident he'd have just enough time to sell them all. However, Sam immediately became frustrated when he realized how slowly the train seemed to move. Sometimes it would just completely stop for a few hours while waiting for more cargo or a crew changeover. It was now obvious why most traders never took a risk on ripe bananas. A few unexpected delays meant a trip that was only supposed to take 3 days could take 5 days. The bananas were beginning to smell and more black freckles were appearing. Sam was running out of time. Just imagine the stress of watching all your savings start to become worthless right before your eyes. And so, when the train got stopped for yet another long delay, Sam ran to a Western Union branch nearby and spoke to the telegraph operator. Sam explained that he had loads of cheap bananas that would be coming through several nearby towns soon. He asked if the telegraph operator would radio every operator ahead and tell them to spread the word to the local merchants, peddlers, and grocery store owners. That way, when the trains arrived in each of these towns, there'd be customers already waiting there ready to buy the bananas whilst the train was stopped. Sam told the operator if he helped spread the word, he'd give him a cut of the sales. And sure enough, this worked. When the train pulled into the next few stations, customers were waiting to meet Sam at the platform, ready to buy these cheap bananas they'd been told about. Because Sam had bought them cheap, he could sell them fairly cheap. And by the end of the week, when the train reached its final destination, he'd sold all the bananas. At the end of it all, Sam was left with $190, meaning a $40 profit for a week's work. But remember, this was the 1890s, so that would work out roughly around $1,400 in today's money. It was more money than he'd ever had in his life, and Sam was thrilled. Not only had his first venture been a success, he seemed to have found a niche in the market with these ripe bananas. There was no way he could have competed with the big established companies if he'd been buying the green bananas. But most companies didn't bother buying ripes because of the stress and relatively small profit margins. And so that was Sam's way in. He could be faster than them. Within just a couple of weeks, Sam returned to the port once again to buy more ripe bananas and repeated the whole process. And then he did it again and again. Every single trip was a gamble, and Sam's life became a blur as he rode from town to town with his boxcar full of ripe bananas, racing against the clock to sell them all. But before long, Sam had perfected his system and gained a bit of a reputation. He simply became known as Sam the Banana Man. However, whilst many respected his hustle, seeing this young guy going back and forth with his ripe bananas, most people would have likely just dismissed him as a hard-working fruit peddler, nothing more. At that point, they truly had no idea what he'd soon become. Sam moved to live near the docks, so he'd be there first thing in the morning when the ships came in and buy every ripe banana he could. The companies who imported the bananas were always happy to see him, as he was one of the only people who actually wanted to buy their ripes. But Sam developed a system where he would further categorize the ripes based on how ripe they were. Those with just a couple of black freckles could easily last 5 or 6 days, whereas the overripes would need to be sold first in the nearest towns. By sorting through them like this, it meant he had a clear order of what to sell first. In 1899, Sam sold 20,000 bananas. By 1903, he was selling well over $500,000 a year. But in 1903, something else very unusual happened. The president of United Fruit, the largest company in the banana business, asked to meet with Sam. United Fruit's president said he liked Sam as he was a risk taker, and during their meeting, the two men agreed a deal. The contract they signed said that all the bananas United Fruit imported that were ripe or turning ripe would be exclusively sold to Sam Murray. This seemed like a win for both sides. United Fruit would have a guaranteed buyer for all their ripes, and Sam had a guaranteed supply of products to sell without needing to endlessly negotiate new deals. What had once seemed like a crazy idea now looked like a very wise business move. By just 21 years old, Sam had over $100,000 saved up, which, adjusting for inflation, would have made him a millionaire in today's terms. And so, if we stop the story right here, it would simply be an underdog success story. But Sam did not stop there. He tasted success and wanted more. The truth is, Sam the Banana Man was just getting started. Sam had had huge success selling ripes, but after a few years, he felt he'd gone as far as he could with that business model. Sam now wanted to expand and get involved in even more lucrative elements of the banana business. For example, rather than just buying the ripe bananas United Fruit had already imported, Sam wanted to import bananas himself from Central America. He could make a lot more money doing this, but it would mean making deals with farmers overseas, as well as buying a fleet of ships to transport the bananas to the United States. And all of this meant he needed both help and investment money. So Sam struck up a partnership with a man named Ashbel Hubbard, and together they invested in a fleet of steamships and also acquired a business called the Guatemalan Fruit Company, which owned 100 acres of land in Honduras, a perfect climate for growing bananas. The plan was to agree deals with farmers out there, then import bananas from Honduras to the United States. But what's interesting is that United Fruit also agreed to put some money in for a small minority stake in Sam's new business and became a silent partner. Given that Sam's new business would be a competitor to United Fruit, this may seem odd, but actually it was standard practice for United Fruit. The reason the company had the nickname El Pulpo, meaning the octopus, is because they wrapped their tentacles around every company in the industry. If you were in the banana trade, United Fruit either owned part of your company or were actively trying to destroy you. This is how United Fruit had risen to dominate the industry, making countless deals with independent banana farmers, importers, and sellers, and then absorbing them into their faceless conglomerate. But United Fruit were strategic about this. Even though they could wipe out all their banana competitors if they wanted to, they deliberately allowed some smaller companies to survive so that they wouldn't be in breach of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was designed to break up monopolies. So United Fruit let some competitors exist, like Sam and his new Guatemalan Fruit Company, as proof to regulators they didn't have a monopoly and there was plenty of fair competition. But the actual reality was that United Fruit dominated the banana industry. They had most of the money, planted the most fields, controlled the supply and demand, and even controlled one of the world's largest private navies, 115 ships called the Great White Fleet. So at this point, Sam was very much a small player in the banana business compared to United Fruit. Of course, moving from just selling ripes to actually importing bananas was a big step up, and Sam was now making hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, but it still wasn't enough for him. Plus, even though Sam was now importing bananas himself, the majority of his money went on paying farmers, sailors, local officials, and working out deals with exporters. The reason United Fruit was so dominant was because they controlled the entire supply chain. Sam realized that unless his business actually grew their own bananas, he could never seriously compete with United Fruit. If Sam wanted to take his business to the next level, he needed to be involved in every step of production. And thus, Sam made the decision to leave behind his life in America and head to the jungle. Sam arrived in Honduras, and it's said that he traveled the entire country by mule as he wanted to get to know the country as well as possible. On his travels, Sam also spent time meeting with many Honduran government officials, looking for special deals so his company wouldn't have to pay the normal taxes and import or export duties. In other words, Sam bribed them. However, this level of corruption was pretty standard. The governments called them concessions. And to be fair, these private deals between businessmen and government officials were kind of essential. The banana business model worked on small margins, which meant needing cheap fruit, cheap labor, cheap land, and no extra taxes or fees. And for a small kickback, government officials were happy to help. So, with deals in place, Sam then managed to buy land in Honduras for dirt cheap prices, as the owners considered it worthless swampland. But Sam, who'd grown up on a farm, knew that beneath all the weeds was valuable soil that could grow all the bananas he needed. Sam then began employing as many workers as he could for his banana operation, and it was brutal physical work, made worse by all the snakes, scorpions, and mosquitoes lurking in the jungle. But Sam often worked in the fields right alongside his workers, covered in sweat, swinging a machete as he helped clear the weeds, lay a track, and plant his crop. And thus, Sam and his team began turning these barren lands into fertile banana farms. Sam actually had contempt for his competitors in the banana trade, who mostly operated their business from boardrooms in America, totally detached from the banana lands where the product was actually grown. Unlike most business executives of other banana companies, Sam embraced the Honduran way of life and became quite friendly with some of the people there. He'd go for drinks with the locals and made a lot of effort to learn their language. Sam also told the locals he'd bring them good jobs. And to his credit, he paid substantially more than other employers in the area. Still dirt cheap wages, but less dirt cheap than competitors. In fact, after the fields had been planted, a town was built for the workers, essentially a small village in the middle of the wilderness where they could live. And that's where Sam spent a lot of his time too. Those years working in the jungle gave Sam an experience in the banana business none of his competitors had. They all worked from offices. Sam had been on the front line, and thus he understood every element of the process, from clearing the jungle, to planting the crops, to exporting the bananas, and then the bananas being sold to customers overseas. Sam would later say that the fact he understood every role within the business and supply chain was the real secret to his success. But at the time, his competitors all thought Sam was crazy, especially as there were stories that Sam would often try bizarre experiments. Like at one point, he ate only bananas. Then he ate everything but bananas. He also tried standing on his head after meals because he'd heard it was better for digestion. It's fair to say he was an interesting character. But regardless, business was going well. With all of the deals Sam had negotiated, he was able to export bananas just as cheaply as the industry leader, United Fruit. And thus, Sam wanted to keep expanding his business further. He had relentless ambition and drive, and began looking for even more land in Honduras, which of course would require more workers and more money. They'd also have to build more infrastructure, like roads and railways, so that the bananas they grew could easily be transported to the docks and shipped off to the United States. The problem was, Sam had already taken out so many loans that no bank wanted to give him any more money. The banana business is risky. Bananas are vulnerable to the heat, to the cold, to lack of rain, to floods, to disease. Basically, there's a lot that can go wrong. But Sam spoke to his business partner back in America and explained he felt this was a golden opportunity, and they had to act fast to buy up as much of this cheap banana land as possible before anyone else did. They needed to scale as quickly as they could and go all in. Sam's business partner did not feel that way. He couldn't believe Sam wanted to take on even more risk, and he instead suggested they should wait and see how things go with the land they already have first, and then gradually reinvest after paying off some of their current loans. Clearly, the two men had different visions and risk tolerance, and so Sam offered to buy out Ashbel's share of the business. Ironically, Sam took on even more debt to finance this deal. And since he was already maxed out on credit from banks, Sam took on loans from more nefarious organizations, such as gangsters and loan sharks. Some of these charged interest rates at almost 50%. But Sam now had the money he needed to expand even faster. And after buying out his business partner's shares, Sam owned 90% of the company, with United Fruit owning the remaining 10%. Sam now had full control to do what he wanted, and he was essentially betting everything on this. It was literally all or nothing. He was either going to build an empire or lose everything. In the next episode in this series, we'll look at how Sam overthrows a government and goes to war against United Fruit. We'll also look at the dark side of the banana business, which is honestly pretty insane. It involves massacres, CIA coups, and lots more. So just click the thumbnail on screen now to go to part 2. The banana industry is responsible for massacres, revolutions, war, and secret deals with the CIA. At one point, the world's largest banana company practically acted like a government in Central America, controlling most of their land and infrastructure. They were responsible for overthrowing presidents who tried to give workers more rights, and installing leaders who helped the banana companies make more money. Honestly, after this video, you will never look at a banana the same way again. This is the disturbing true story of the banana business. Now, in episode 1 of this series, we looked at the rise of Sam the Banana Man, how a penniless immigrant made a fortune selling ripe bananas and worked his way up to becoming a major player in the banana business. If you haven't yet seen episode 1, you can click here or click the link in the pinned comment below. But in this episode, we're gonna look at what happened next, as once Sam became involved with a company called United Fruit, the story takes a much darker turn. In order to get lower taxes and fees, Sam had made lots of shady private deals with government officials in Honduras. But what do you do when a politician you've bought becomes unbought and stops following the deal you've agreed? This was the situation Sam faced, as he began to hear rumors that all the deals and bribes he'd made were in doubt. The reason for this was because in the 1870s, Honduras had started an ambitious national railroad project, and they'd taken out loans from British banks to fund it. However, the project ran out of money before it ever finished, leaving them with miles of track that didn't go anywhere and no income to repay the loans. By 1900, those loans had been accruing years of compound interest, and in total, Honduras owed around $100 million to British banks, far more than it could afford. The bankers were now demanding settlement, and suggested if Honduras didn't pay up, the British Navy could get involved. The United States was concerned by all this. Any European military action could violate the Monroe Doctrine, which would basically mean the US had to get involved in the conflict. So the US government proposed a different idea. They recruited the help of the most powerful banker in America, JP Morgan, and asked him to buy all the outstanding Honduran railroad bonds, refinance the debt, and issue new loans. In return, JP Morgan asked to take ownership of the Honduran railroad system and for his bank to collect taxes on all imports to Honduras. The proposal worked for almost everyone. It worked for the British as they got their loan repaid, it worked for the Honduran and American governments as there'd be no military conflict, and it worked for JP Morgan as in the long run he'd make a lot of money. There were really only two groups who didn't benefit from the deal. Number one was the people of Honduras, who considered the terms a forfeit of national sovereignty, and the other group who suffered from the deal was business owners like Sam Zamurri. Sam's entire business model was dependent on the concessions and deals he'd made with the Honduran government. The only reason Sam could compete on price with the industry leader, United Fruit, was because his company was exempt from things like import duties, which allowed him to keep costs low. However, JP Morgan made it very clear that those kind of deals would no longer be honored. Sam would have to pay all these extra taxes, which meant Sam's costs would increase significantly, and he'd no longer be able to sell his bananas as cheaply as United Fruit. Thus, his entire business was at serious risk of collapsing. Something had to be done. Sam immediately began trying to stop the plan. To begin with, he hired lobbyists to put pressure on the White House and managed to get an endless amount of newspaper articles published which said America needed to stop interfering in foreign affairs. The US government was surprised that this was generating so much publicity and backlash, and they soon found out that the man behind all of this media attention and lobbyist groups was Sam Zamurri, aka the Banana Man. So in 1910, Sam was summoned to Washington to meet the Secretary of State. In that meeting, he was told very bluntly, "Don't meddle in this. This is much bigger than your banana business. Stay out of the way." Sam nodded along as if he agreed, but in reality, he of course had no intention to let this plan go ahead. The United States may have a deal in place with the president of Honduras, but what if he wasn't the president anymore? As crazy as this sounds, Sam's plan was to overthrow the Honduran government and install a new president who would continue to honor his tax breaks and concessions. Of course, by doing this, Sam was defying JP Morgan and the United States government. But this was his business at stake. And so the first thing Sam did was to rile up the Honduran people by showing them how the Americans were going to take money on all their imports and claim ownership of the Honduran railroad. Sam hired newspaper writers to write endless stories to get Honduran citizens scared of the deal and get them angry at the current Honduran leadership for being incompetent and allowing this to happen. The idea was to create so much outrage that people would be supportive of a change in leadership. Next, Sam set about finding someone he could present as a better alternative to run the country, and he found the answer in Manuel Bonilla, who'd already been the president of Honduras once before and thus already had a lot of support within the country. Sam secretly met with Bonilla and said he'd help him get re-elected in exchange for honoring all the concessions and tax breaks Sam wanted. The two men got on well and a deal was agreed. Next, Sam began building a team of mercenaries, which would be led by Bonilla's right-hand man, a guy called Lee Christmas. Sam then invested heavily in all the resources they would need to overthrow the government, including a 160-foot ex-Navy warship and a vast quantity of explosives and weapons. Lee Christmas also began recruiting more and more people for Bonilla's Army of Liberation, and once they had enough men, this mercenary army arrived in Honduras in September 1910. They took city after city and recruited more revolutionaries along the way, since Sam had done a great job of creating a lot of anger towards the current Honduran president. Their rebel force was growing, and they demanded that the current Honduran president step down. And here was another stroke of genius from Sam. They told the president if he didn't step down, they would send in reinforcements. But in truth, they didn't have reinforcements. They were bluffing. But the Honduran president thought he was outnumbered and he stepped down as leader. Shortly after, Bonilla was inaugurated as the new president of Honduras. Pretty much his first major act as president was to give Sam all the concessions he wanted for the next 25 years. This included permission to import any equipment he wanted duty-free, along with permission to build all the railroads and infrastructure he could possibly need. Bonilla also gave Sam 25,000 acres of land in Honduras that he could claim later when he needed it. And Bonilla even gave Sam a $500,000 loan to repay all the expenses he'd incurred for funding this revolution. In other words, Sam had got everything he wanted. No duties, no taxes, and even free land, a repayment for the money he'd spent in funding this coup. Plus, Sam now had the president of Honduras in his pockets. It was later said that no American businessman ever held a foreign nation's destiny so completely in his hands. Sam had single-handedly funded and led a coup in Honduras and got a new president installed, all to reduce the cost of his banana business. And all of this meant that Sam now had everything he needed to take down United Fruit. For many years, United Fruit had dominated the banana business. They had a huge fleet of ships that transported bananas from Central America to countries all over the world. And over time, some of these Central American countries became dependent on United Fruit for other things, like delivering their mail and cargo. This gave United Fruit a vast amount of power. For example, if the countries did something United Fruit didn't like, or workers tried to go on strike over the brutal working conditions, United Fruit could stop deliveries and completely cripple their economy. Plus, as well as completely owning the supply chain for bananas, United Fruit had total control over their workers. They controlled their houses, their shops, their transportation. In fact, United Fruit often didn't pay their workers in actual cash, but instead in vouchers that could only be used in stores owned by United Fruit. I mean, they paid extremely low amounts anyway, but even the money they did give to workers could only be spent in stores United Fruit owned, so they got all the money back. In places like Guatemala, United Fruit became the largest company in the country, and often felt more like a government than a business. They owned the majority of the arable land, politicians bowed down to them, and they even had the nickname the Octopus, since their tentacles were wrapped around everything in Central America, from the people to the infrastructure. Nowadays, the phrase Banana Republic usually describes an unstable country that's heavily dependent on a single export, like bananas. However, the term Banana Republic was initially coined to describe countries who were under economic exploitation by US corporations such as the United Fruit Company. What's interesting though, is once United Fruit began controlling the supply of bananas in many of these countries, they then needed to create more demand for bananas. They had to get consumers in places like the United States and the United Kingdom to want to buy vast quantities of bananas, because originally bananas were nowhere near as popular as they are today. So, United Fruit came up with several genius marketing strategies. Firstly, United Fruit hired agents to stand at ferry terminals in the US and hand a banana to everyone who arrived in the country and say, "Welcome to America." The whole idea was that people would associate the banana with the United States, even though in reality, no bananas were even grown in the US. Secondly, United Fruit began making as many banana-themed products as they could. There was banana flour and banana bread, and even baby food made from bananas, so they could hook consumers from a very early age. United Fruit also paid doctors to write academic reports about how brilliant and nutritious bananas were, and United Fruit also launched recipe books which all utilized bananas to drum up more demand for them. They even began a massive ad campaign encouraging people to add bananas to their cereal. If you know someone who still does this today, it likely all comes from United Fruit's relentless marketing. However, one of their most successful marketing efforts was introducing the Miss Chiquita character, who became the face of bananas. People seemed to love this, and sure enough, what had once been an exotic fruit started to become a staple of the Western diet. United Fruit managed to create this wholesome, happy image of bananas coming from a tropical paradise where the workers loved working. People had no idea about the brutal conditions these bananas were actually grown in, how the workers were treated, and the dark past of the company they were buying from. But still, thanks to United Fruit's huge marketing efforts, the banana business was thriving. And for many years, United Fruit dominated the industry and went pretty much unchallenged. The only competitors they had were much smaller businesses, which United Fruit often owned a percentage of anyway. But by 1910, for the first time, a real potential competitor was emerging. Guatemalan Fruit, the banana business run by Sam. When Sam first started out selling ripe bananas, nobody had taken him seriously. But over the years, Sam had grown his business more and more and was becoming increasingly successful. Plus, he'd just overthrown a government in Honduras in order to get better tax breaks. So clearly it was time for United Fruit to start taking Sam a little more seriously. Now that Sam had got a new leader in place in Honduras, he had all the tax breaks he needed to keep expanding his business, Guatemalan Fruit. However, United Fruit still owned 10% of his company, and Sam was keen to change that and be fully independent. Sam felt just his mere association to United Fruit was bad for his brand's reputation. For example, a few years earlier, Nicaraguan banana growers had boycotted United Fruit and blocked its ships from sailing down its rivers. But United Fruit simply broke the blockade with force. It was brutal. But since United Fruit owned 10% of Sam's company, his business suffered by association, so Sam was keen to part ways with them completely. Obviously, United Fruit had no interest in selling their shares though. They always liked to retain some control over their competitors. But in 1913, they wouldn't have a choice. It all began when Congress proposed a banana tax. Immediately, United Fruit hired an endless amount of lobbyists to attack this plan. But this backfired on United Fruit. The Justice Department then opened an investigation into their business and concluded that the way United Fruit colluded to fix prices and the way they repeatedly crushed or bought out competitors was proof they had a stranglehold on the banana business and thus were violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Whilst the investigation was ongoing, United Fruit realized they had to try and prove that there was fair competition in the banana industry, or else United Fruit would get broken up and lose their dominance. And thus, one of the ways they could do this was selling their 10% stake in Guatemalan Fruit back to Sam. That way, United Fruit could basically say to the US government, "Look, here's a genuine competitor to our business, and we don't own any of his company, so clearly we don't have a monopoly on the banana industry." And this worked. United Fruit sold their 10% back to Sam, and the Justice Department never filed any charges against them. However, in later years, when Sam became more powerful, analysts would look back at this moment as a huge mistake by United Fruit for letting Sam become totally independent. Of course, for Sam, this was amazing news. He now had 100% control of his business, Guatemalan Fruit. Although this did mean him and United Fruit were now in very direct competition. Thus, the stage was set for the Banana War. United Fruit vs Guatemalan Fruit, the octopus vs Sam the Banana Man. Now, it's important to stress at this point, Sam was still very much the little guy. Sure, he'd had a lot of success, but his company was still much smaller. United Fruit harvested 40 million bananas a year, Guatemalan 8 million. United Fruit had 150,000 workers, Guatemalan had 10,000. United Fruit had working capital of 27 million, Guatemalan had 3 million. However, in terms of profit margin and efficiency, Sam's business was undeniably better. His business was leaner, more streamlined, and thus he could move faster. Whereas United Fruit had become quite bloated, bureaucratic, and slow, Sam was constantly innovating. He found ways to improve drainage, he implemented an overhead irrigation system using sprinklers, he tied banana plants to bamboo to protect the stems and keep them straight, he had his workers walk the fields and rip out the runts. Basically, Sam was continuously running experiments, and as a result, he developed a huge amount of unique strategies that resulted in banana plants with more bunches. He had greater output per acre and less spoilage. He perfected the art of growing bananas. It helped that Sam had worked in every position in the trade, from growing and picking the bananas himself, to managing the money, negotiating with politicians for better deals, shipping the bananas, selling the bananas. He understood every role fully, and since he was often working in the jungle himself, he knew his work as well. Most of them respected Sam, unlike United Fruit, who were more of a faceless conglomerate run by the suits back in America. Sam also reinvested heavily in his business. In truth, he was a bit of a gambler. Whereas many people would extract profits from the company, he just wanted more and more growth. After acquiring yet more land in Honduras, he began expanding to other countries, setting up banana plantations in Mexico and Nicaragua. For the first time, United Fruit had a genuine competitor, and Sam seemed to enjoy the competition. He actively began poaching some of United Fruit's employees, and when an interviewer asked him about United Fruit, he said he loved poking the monster in the knees. However, in 1915, things escalated further between these two companies. The Utila River roughly follows the border between Honduras and Guatemala, and the area had kind of acted as a buffer, because United Fruit farmed the land north of the river, and Sam and Guatemalan Fruit farmed the land south of the river. It was a dividing line that kept the peace. But remember when Sam led a coup to remove the president of Honduras and put in Manuel Bonilla instead? As a thank you, Bonilla had promised Sam 24,700 acres of land at a future date. And in 1915, Sam was ready to redeem that, and he claimed some jungle land just north of the Utila, land that was meant to be the neutral zone that separated the two companies. As soon as Sam declared he wanted to take that land, United Fruit saw it as an act of war. Any kind of truce they'd had in place was now over, and both companies began racing to acquire all the land they could in the area. The two companies also began taunting each other. For example, United Fruit sent agents over the river one night to rip up Guatemalan Fruit's railway tracks and cut their water lines. Sam of course then responded by sending his own agents over the river to retaliate. The tensions between the two banana companies also acted as a proxy between the two countries, Honduras and Guatemala, who were also in conflict. So basically, political and business tensions were running very high. By 1917, the Banana War was centered on a 5,000-acre piece of land that bordered the river to the north. Both banana companies wanted this land. But currently the territory seemed to have two separate legal owners. So even though both companies wanted to buy it, it was unclear who the real owner actually was. United Fruit was a much bigger company with an army of lawyers, so they set about trying to figure out who was the true owner of the land so United Fruit could buy it from them. In the meantime, Sam had a much simpler idea. He simply bought the land from both the people who claimed to own it. Sure, this meant paying twice, but it meant whilst United Fruit was busy wasting time and money on lawyers, Sam had got the land for himself. It was a humiliation for United Fruit, and Sam now owned more land north of the river, which was supposed to be United Fruit territory. But now that Guatemalan was operating on both sides of the river, Sam needed a bridge to transport his bananas. However, by this point, the government had changed leaders again, and United Fruit seemed to be bribing the government more than Sam, so his request to build a bridge across the river got rejected. So, like Sam always did, he simply found a way around this. He built extra long docks on both the north and south shores of the river, and then had his engineers build a floating barge that could basically act as a bridge so he could transport his bananas. It was a loophole. It wasn't technically a bridge, but it was basically a bridge. Once again, United Fruit were furious. They retaliated by purchasing thousands of acres of land in the Honduran highlands. The land wasn't even suitable for growing bananas, so at first this seemed strange. But then Sam realized that the land contained the headwaters to the rivers that watered most of Sam's crops. If United Fruit blocked or rerouted the rivers, it could have devastating effects on all of Sam's banana plantations downstream that relied on that water. So, as you can see, tensions had been boiling between the two companies for years, but it was getting to the point where the region seemed on the verge of literal war. At one point, Sam began loading his ships up with guns and bullets. Back in the United States, the State Department became very concerned by all this. Two US fruit companies were on the verge of plunging the entire region into war. The US was also concerned that this banana war was breeding hatred for the United States in Central America, and thus was threatening American interests. US government diplomats decided to intervene and arranged what was essentially a peace conference between the leaders of these two fruit companies. Once again, Sam was summoned to Washington. After several meetings, it was concluded that the only way to end this feud between United Fruit and Guatemalan Fruit was some kind of merger or buyout. If they were on the same team rather than enemies, peace would be restored, and thus negotiations began. There was of course a bizarre irony that the United States government was suggesting this. The only reason United Fruit and Guatemalan Fruit had become enemies in the first place was because the US had been investigating United Fruit over being a monopoly. But now the United States government wanted United Fruit and Guatemalan Fruit to merge together in order to bring peace. By merging together, they'd control 68% of the banana market, as at this point United Fruit had a 54% share and Guatemalan had 14%. But the US obviously figured having one extremely dominant company was better than two companies at war with each other. However, even though the US government wanted them to merge, and United Fruit probably wanted it too, it's likely Sam would have had doubts. Guatemalan Fruit was his baby that he'd spent years building, and he'd defied the US government once before, why not do it again? But this time things felt different. Sam was a lot older now, and had a lot more to lose. Plus, all of this coincided with an economic crash where many companies' stock prices were plummeting, so it seemed like a wise time to attach himself to an unstoppable giant like United Fruit and cash out whilst his business was still at its peak value. And thus in 1929, the deal was agreed. Guatemalan Fruit would merge with United Fruit, creating one ultra-dominant force in the banana industry. United Fruit would take possession of all Guatemalan's land and absorb Sam's business into their empire. The deal was structured as a stock swap. In exchange for his Guatemalan shares, Sam received 300,000 shares of United Fruit, which at the time was worth a little over $30 million US, over $500 million in today's money. Sam had arrived in America with nothing, and he was now one of the richest men in the country. This deal also made Sam the largest shareholder of United Fruit. In return though, Sam agreed to completely retire from the banana trade. He signed a non-compete clause, and United Fruit made it clear Sam would have no involvement in the company at all. And to be honest, Sam was probably very glad that he had no involvement in what happened next.